If you've ever felt trapped by your past, if you've ever struggled to move past your grief, or lost yourself in trying to please everyone else, then this conversation with Debi Richens will help you rise from the ashes and rebuild a life with purpose and meaning. In this podcast, Evolution of a Human, it's supposed to be my job to inspire you to make the changes you know you want to make, and maybe even give you a few hints. But instead, I'm going to let my guests do that. Learn from their stories and the obstacles that they've overcome to be who they are today. All right, today we are joined by Debi Richens. She's a transformational coach and she is the relationship phoenix, where she helps you transform relationships, especially with yourself. Debi, thank you for joining me today.
No, thank you for asking. I'm very delighted to be here.
So, relationship with self.
Yes, relationship
What
with self.
what took you in this direction?
Actually, my own journey, coming from a very disrupted childhood, being the oldest child, being the only girl, being expected to step up to the plate every time my mother was sick, having a father that was completely absent, and grandparents that expected me to step up and do when they weren't there to do. So there was a lot of expectation, a lot of pressure. And as we do, until we've really got our eyes open, we follow the societal norms because it's all we know. At school, I was told I was useless because I wasn't there as much as I could have been because I was at home looking after my mum or I was sick myself. So childhood was very disrupted. Going into adulthood, I did the normal thing, getting a job, going out to work, getting a little bed sit, setting myself up, living a strange life with people coming and going in my world, as we all do when we're in our late teens, early adulthood. Not really feeling very settled. And then my mother was very, very ill, and she'd moved from one town to another in the UK, and she needed me to come home. And I had my middle brother telling me, I'm not going to do it. You've got to come home. So I gave up my little bit of independence, I gave up my job, and I moved back home, which for me was completely new because that had never been my home. So I'd only ever visited. And then I met someone. And as you do, it's all hearts and flowers, and you go off and you get married and you do all those things. And his brother died in a car accident, and he just went to pieces. And I was only working in a little part-time farm job for the roof over our head. So I didn't really have that capability of being independent. And I was forced to find other ways to grow and to bring income into the house because where he was grieving and he wouldn't deal with his grief, he just shut down and he wasn't earning. So it was a very tough time. And then a few years later, I wanted to have a child, and that meant a huge change again. And, him taking more responsibility. It was a strange time. It was a very strange time. And after 20 years, there had been lots of experiences that I found very difficult, and I couldn't stay in that anymore. And I asked for a divorce. And stepping out on my own when I had expected grown up behavior actually was incredibly tough because it wasn't grown up behavior. And I had to be very independent very quickly. Thank goodness for my childhood because it gave me a lot of pointers in how, but it still wasn't the right place to find myself. And I was still stuck in a very strange mindset. Going through bullying in dentistry made me see that I could not stay within that industry after 20 years. And I felt compelled to come away. I didn't have a job to go to. Thankfully, I had a wonderful partner. But also at the same time, his mother had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And so I stepped up and I started to give her more support. And it gave me time to sort of think more about what I wanted to do. And then I started a business. Wasn't expecting to, but that came about through need. So I started this business and I had all the big boys in the game saying, oh, you can't do that. Nobody can do that. I proved them wrong, but I wasn't able to continue. After 6 years, it had to fold because of health issues. But through that time, I'd learned about grief and all the different aspects of grief. That's when the penny dropped for me that I wasn't whole and I needed to dig within myself and find that part of me that was missing. And when I did the grief training, everything changed. And
Hmm.
that's, where I am now with the relationship work, because it's about looking within who we are. It's about having compassion and love for ourselves. And, my generation, I'm 60, we weren't taught those things. We were taught to put ourselves last. And my whole childhood had been about putting myself last, as well as my young adulthood. And then from that, I moved straight into a marriage, put myself last, so nowhere in that time did I learn how important it was to look after me, how I should learn to forgive myself, how I should learn to love myself and be compassionate towards me so that I can give better to everybody else and shine as me.
Mhm.
And it's been a massive growth journey, and I'm still growing. There are still aspects to find, but it's a joy to find them now. The first few years were tough. It was like, the typical phrase is peeling an onion. And it really
Yeah.
was, years and years of taking layer after layer off. But once I learned the tools, and once I then expanded my tools with a further set of tools, it made me so well equipped, and my own life experiences have made me so well equipped that helping other people with their relationships now is just a joy.
Beautiful. So it sounds like there was a lot of giving parts of yourself away through
Very
all
much
this
so.
process. Um, I'm curious about the when you moved out of London, when you moved back to this new home because your mum needed your
Mm,
help to look
yes,
after her. You said that that was a new home for you. It
it
was her
was
home,
indeed.
but
Yeah. So,
it was new for you. So what career did you take up while trying to balance looking after your mother?
so at that time, actually, I was unemployed. I was 19 and unemployed
Okay.
because I literally had to give up my job. I was living in Reading at the time. She was working on the railway, so she'd been made up to be the first lady undermaster in the country. And they sent her off to Swindon, quite big station. And they sent her off to Swindon to go play with the trains in Swindon. And so she bought her first house in Swindon. So it was a completely new home to me, as was Swindon. I knew it from visits in childhood, but I didn't really know it very well. So, of course, going to look after her first and foremost meant I couldn't work and be a carer
Hmm.
because she'd had very serious bowel surgery after cancer and she needed some extra support to get herself back on her feet.
I see.
So right at the beginning, it was a case of, go home and be the dutiful daughter,
Yeah.
especially when the one brother that was living at home was absolutely adamant that he wasn't going to do it. So, oh, I love your visitor. Peekaboo.
It's a good one.
Yeah, the cutie. So yeah, it was an interesting time of learning, and in those days I did the typical Shanks's pony on foot, and I absolutely loved it. I loved exploring. It's a lovely town, and it
Yeah.
it was that much quieter generally. There wasn't that massive hubbub of London where I'd been born,
Yep.
and Reading was very busy. but it wasn't quite as busy as London. But
Yep.
Swindon again was a bit quieter, a bit more gentle. People would hold doors open, which was a revelation because that hadn't happened for years. So it was a lovely pace of life to get used to again.
Mm.
And people would greet you in the street, which was just lovely because those things were disappearing in Reading and they'd already almost disappeared in London. So you can see how that transition was going,
Yeah.
but it was showing me parts of me that actually I really craved, being
Mm.
out in the countryside and being much closer to the countryside.
Did you
And
find that as you moved, London, Reading, and now to Swindon, that helped you open up in the same kind of a way that you?
not at the time, not at the time, because I was still that naive teenager, that 19-year-old that had had a bit of a tough growing up life
Mm.
and was holding on to the fact that actually my mum was very seriously ill and we didn't really know which way it was going to go. Although everybody said, oh, it's all wonderful, she's healing, you never really
Mm.
know. And because I'd been used to her actually being quite close to death several times in my life, there was always that fear. So I,
Yeah.
I lived in that place of not really settled.
Okay.
And it was tough because then I had the older brother come home, and my younger brother had grown up with our grandparents due to my mother's health. But he also came home. So suddenly the house became very full. And along with my brothers were all their mates. So I had
Oh,
this wonderful collection of boys in my life that I've grown up with, but they were none of them my brothers, but the house was always full. So that also was something to get used to because I'd had my little bed sit all on my own, shut
mm.
my door, I was on my own, and all of a sudden there was a house full of blokes all the time, which was fine. They were lovely. They all treat me like a big sister, but it didn't really have comfort, if that makes
Mm.
sense, when there's a lot of people around all the time, and things like I'd go and buy the food and put things in the fridge to have for my lunches and come back and all be
Oh
gone,
God.
you know. So
Yeah.
it, it it was home, but it didn't feel like home because I had no control over those things. And so I was still in that place of societal imprint, if you
Mm.
like, following the rules, doing what I was expected to do, and not getting very far very fast. And then I went for a job interview, and amazingly, in those days, it wouldn't happen now, but in those days, my new manager actually walked up the road from the town and came and knocked on the door and told me personally I had the job.
Oh,
And
fantastic.
that was just, oh, I was so excited. I was just 20 and I hugged him on the doorstep because I was so excited. And he was this tiny little man from South America. And he lived in Cheltenham, so and he'd lived in England and married to a UK lady, been here a very long time. But he was just like, oh, okay. I was just so excited, and it was like, and I have to say, it was the best job offer I've ever had in my life. Having my new employer on my doorstep telling me you've got the job was wonderful,
Yeah, you don't
and
get that these days.
not at all. And it was exceptional then as well, really. So that sort of brought a spark into my life. But actually, my spark didn't really start until I'd had my daughter, and my dentist then rang me up and asked me if I'd like to go and work for him.
Ah,
Yeah,
okay.
he knew that I was a young mum that was wondering how I was going to supplement my income. And he obviously saw something in me then that he could grow with,
Yeah,
for his own
yeah.
practice. And that was an extraordinary place of learning because I went in as a part-time receptionist when we had the old-fashioned pencil and paper and, rubbers everywhere to rub out appointments that were changed. And I had to learn about patient care. I had to learn basic, what was going on in dentistry so I could
Mm.
understand, so I could talk to the patients and reassure them. I had to learn accounts management, and all kinds of stuff. And a lot of it was quite simple, normal admin stuff, but then there was a lot of other stuff that went with it, and it was the people skills. And that's really where I honed my people skills. Because when you've got people coming in the door going because they're in pain or they're very angry, you've got to learn to calm them down and bring them into a safe space so that A, you can understand what they're trying to say to you, B, you can assure them, and C, you can get them the treatment they need. And I became very good at it to the point that there were people that would not come in the door because they were terrified of coming to the dentist. But I was the person that was able to get them to come in the door. And I have no idea where that skill came from, but it's the basis of where I am now when I deal with my clients now.
Yeah, of course. I'm sure it comes from having to manage your brothers from a young
Oh,
age.
I don't know about that.
Yeah.
I don't think I managed them terribly well at all. I may have been the eldest and I may have been the only girl, but I was definitely well and truly put upon.
All right. So a very strong lesson in managing people.
Yes, very much so.
And being a chiropractor or a former chiropractor, yeah, there's an art to bringing people down from either too high or bringing them up to a state where you can work with them.
Yes, yes, very much so.
Uh, it's not an easy skill to learn.
No, no, I think it very much comes from instinct.
Mm,
Wherever that came from in me, that's where I blossomed when I went into dentistry.
absolutely. So then working with current clients, how did you get into your current role?
Well,
How long
so the divorce
Okay.
was the beginning of it. So as I was going through the divorce and I was also experiencing the bullying, I had the bullying in dentistry from dentists who wanted to earn their money but didn't really want to do all the job for
Mhm.
all the patients. And, as a chiropractor, I'm sure you
Yep.
appreciate where that's coming from. Um, there were some fantastic dentists that I worked with, but also there were some that were just interested in the baseline and
Completely.
weren't worried about everything else. And I could never get my head around the baseline because in that 20 years in dentistry, I'd learned that the patient comes first, their needs come first. And
Yeah.
so in the latter years, when I was in practice management, that I found very difficult to get my head around
Mm.
because, for me, patients in pain, patient needs care, dentists and nurses need looking after because by that time I was a practice manager, so their needs also need to be met, and I need to bring those two together. And, if it's all about money, how the heck do I bring this all together? So I
Yeah.
was living with that in my day life. And alongside that, I was living with divorce abuse and post-divorce abuse, which was the most bizarre thing. It was like being at war, but not wanting to be at war, but being forced to be in a position that I couldn't extricate myself from. And it was very, very tough to the point that my body kicked back and I developed a singular gallstone, and they are created from extreme stress and distress. And I
Absolutely.
didn't know that until the surgeon told me afterwards. I've only seen two of these in 24 years. And that was quite a shock. And it was enormous. It was just shy of the size of a tennis ball.
Okay.
So I was very, very ill, but I didn't really realize how much that was going to affect my life at the time. So there was a lot going on, and I was just in this survival mode. I had to keep a roof over my head. And ironically, I went back to living in a bedsit, and I moved back to Newbury, where I am now. I was living in a shared house with people half my age, all different nationalities. Didn't phase me one bit, but I felt very isolated, very alone. And I didn't realize then the underbelly of what grief is and what grief does to us, because my childhood, my generation, all we were ever told was grief is death. We
Mm.
weren't told that grief is divorce, loss of friendships, isolation, financial issues, health issues, job issues,
Yeah.
bullying issues, all of these things. I didn't know any of that was grief, and nobody, the professionals around me, nobody ever used the word grief. So I was very stuck. And then of course I got to the point where the bullying dentistry, I'd had enough. I couldn't do it anymore. And I just said to my partner, look, I really need to come away from this. It's absolutely crucifying me. I was traveling an hour there and back each day. So, and I'd have to be there at the crack of dawn, and I'd be coming home very late after I'd closed up and sent everybody on their way. And I was exhausted emotionally, physically, and I just thought, I can't do this anymore. So we had this conversation, and yeah, I'll support you for a little while. Let's see what else we can do for you. And of course, at the same time, his mother had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's and needed more support because she was in that why me phase. So she needed a lot more hands-on support. And although I'd always been there for her from the beginning of our relationship, she needed more. So I stayed with her for a short time, and supported her. At the same time, looking after my own mother, who now was living in Gloucester because she was the first lady station master in this country in Gloucester. So they gave her the royal station to play with. You can have royal trains this time. So, I was running backwards and forwards to Gloucester, caring for my mum-in-law here, thinking, how on earth is this all going to happen? Not really in that mindset of changing anything because I didn't know anything different. So I
Mm.
just lived in that constant stress, that constant survival mode. And then I started up a bra making business. Came from my own need, couldn't get comfortable bras. The bra making industry at the time was miles behind. It's caught up a bit now, but it was miles behind at the time. So I went up to Leicester and I learned how to make bras. And I came
Yeah.
back and I started making bras. And I made bespoke bras for 6 years whilst caring for my mother-in-law and my mother. It taught me a massive amount of things, but at the same time, it also helped me to keep my head straight with all the post-divorce abuse that was still going on.
So this is
So,
all post-divorce,
yes, yes.
and you're still looking after your mother-in-law.
Well, I was at that point, yeah. So no, the mother-in-law wasn't ex-mother-in-law.
Yeah.
Mother-in-law was new partner's mother.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. So, um, no, it was a strange time, very
Mm.
strange time. And I had health issues that came up. Again, they were related to all the abuse and the bullying that I was going through, the distress that my body was experiencing. And in 2015, I had another emergency surgery for something else, and the business had to go. But at that point, I'd proved the big boys wrong. When they all said, oh, you can't make bras in a small blah, 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 I did it. It wasn't as successful as I'd like it to have been. I could have been closer to Leicester, but I was the wrong end of the country. It would have made a difference having that other industry around me,
Yeah.
So it, but it is what it is. It was an experience, and thank goodness I could sew. That would have been a whole another thing if I didn't know how to use a sewing machine when I started that journey. But it proved to me that I was capable of doing something different.
Mm.
And whilst I was busy networking for that business, as we do as we're growing our businesses, I met a lady who was talking about grief. And she was talking about it from a completely different perspective. And I sat and I read the back of the book that she showed me. And I just thought, that makes so much sense. And I could see my journey in those few words on the back of that book. I've got to do that training. How am I going to do that training? I'm growing this business. I'm driving all over the place for parents, and I don't have 5 minutes for myself, and I don't have a lot of income at that time because it's all going into the business. So then I had a car accident, and again, it gave me another shift to think about what's going on. It was nothing to do with me. It was a whole pile of other people not taking notice of what they were doing, and I happened to be the sandwich in the middle, as you do. But thankfully I got away from it, without too much, except a bit of a, yeah, think again. What is it you need to do? And the payment came from the car accident, and I thought, I'm going to invest this in doing this training. And the barrister was wanting to know what I was going to do with the money before he released it to me. And I told him, and he said, "What's a grief recovery specialist then?" I said, "Well, basically, it's a coach who teaches people how to understand the grief they're experiencing and how to understand it's not just death. It's actually all of our life experiences. That move from one school to another when you've left all your friends behind, that move because you've had to move because mum and dad split up, the financial issues, the health issues, the friendship issues, the isolation, the blah, blah, blah." And he sat there and he said to me, "Well, I think that's wonderful. You'll have your money this afternoon."
All
just
right.
just sort of sat there and thought, okay, so I had to be interviewed to have the money from yeah, okay, fine, no problem. But within 24 hours, I'd paid for my training, I'd paid for the accommodation, and got myself all booked in. And I went and did the training in June 2016. And it was life-changing, absolutely life-changing within 2 days, because we had to do the process we were teaching
Yep.
first. And in that first 24 hours, I had so many aha moments. By the 48 hours, there'd been a real shift and a breakthrough. And I was like a dog with a bone. I literally held on to everything I'd learned. And I kept doing the process. And I was so religious about it. Everybody else was like, "Well, we're going to do one a month for 4 months." And I said, "I'm going to do one a week for 6 weeks." And they all looked at me. Well, my plan was I was going to do everything the day before my 55th birthday. It was all going to be cleared and done. And then I could then start this next journey of my life and see where it was going to take me. And yeah, that was a biggie. But the shifts that happened in that, 7 week period from when I went to train to just before my 55th birthday were transformational. And that just brings me so much joy because I do that for others now.
So it sounds like it was almost like it was finally a shift in your life that you chose
Yes,
for
very.
yourself, by yourself, instead of
Yes.
having had it chosen for you.
Hmm. Yeah. And very much, and that was it. I had a way of being independent for the first time in my life, making that choice about how do I actually want to do that thing called work?
Mm.
And do I want it to be work, or do I want it to be a vocation? Whereas in dentistry, it had been a career, because that was the term that was used in the 80s when we were all leaving school, a career. And actually, to me, it's not even a vocation, it's just who I am.
Almost like a coming home.
Yeah, very much.
Beautiful.
And then in 2021, 2020, I stepped into NLP and hypnotherapy just
Yeah.
very basically, just to start a diploma. But there was something there that I knew would help me go further. And I progressed the training through to master practitioner and then through to trainer for NLP and hypnotherapy.
Oh,
And that
fantastic.
again has been life-changing because it's expanded every skill that I'd grown up to that point. And it's a bit like, getting to the top of Everest. It's a
Yeah, it's not
wonderful
easy work, is it?
No, not at all. But it's been so transformational. It's brought so many more tools into my wonderful toolkit that I already had. It's allowed me to expand my life experiences to a really profound place because I can share those in a much healthier way now, and people are seeing them for what they are. It's not an ego trip. Yes, I've done this. Yes, that's happened to me, blah, blah, blah. It's real life, but it's real life without all the dredge of emotion that goes with it, which is where I was when I first did my grief training.
It is very interesting how people will assume that the emotions that they feel are them,
Yes.
or the thoughts
Yes.
that they think are them,
Hmm.
instead of being the observer behind all of that,
Hmm.
watching all of this happen.
Exactly that. And
Um,
this is where I am now. I can observe now in a really healthy way, which I couldn't have done at all. I was too deeply entwined in it. And I didn't have people around me at the time that could really understand what I needed to help me. So they would tell me their version of how they were going to help me, but it didn't always do the job. I did a wonderful EFT course, which really helped me to start to get my head around things. But it was the grief training that allowed me to step out of it fully.
yeah.
And because it allowed me to see myself rather than just keep clearing layers and layers without truly understand what I was clearing away. And that was a magical difference. And this is what I love to do with my clients now. I love to give them that space to learn who they are.
So, who are your clients these days? Who do you work with?
Well, I work with a variety of people, mainly women, and I mainly aim my work at women, but I do work with men as well. Mainly people who are actually going through family breakdown, family alienation, which is what I've experienced for 20 years, and estrangement, which has been part of that journey. So, alienation is about where one parent creates a diversionary tactic to start to cause damage to the relationship between the parent who's left the family home or left the family for whatever reason. Um, and disconnects the child from that parent and also that parent's family. So the child suddenly loses grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, sometimes siblings, depending on the relationships. Especially in same-sex couples, when they break down, they'll often have an egg from one if it's female, and an egg from another, and then a donor, and that gets complicated. And I know people in that position, and it's tough because then not only is the parent grieving all that disconnection, but they're also grieving the child that's with them that's lost, but that child is also grieving.
Yeah.
And what I couldn't protect my daughter no matter how I tried because I was in such a place of deep grief myself. I had no comprehension of what was happening. Nobody talked about it. Everybody did the there, it'll be all right. It'll change when she's done her exams. It'll change when she's left home. It'll change when she gets a boyfriend. It'll change when she gets a baby. But all of those things just made it worse because every time those things happened, I was pushed further and further away.
Hmm.
And it felt excruciating because I literally was walking on eggshells. I was terrified to say anything when I did see her. And she became a very snarly teenager in a very short space of time. And because I was in such a difficult place, I didn't know how to manage that. And it was really tough. And the phrase was heartbreaking, and my heart hurt deeply at the time. Now, I don't feel that distress and that pain anymore because I've managed to understand that actually it was my own inner child that was so damaged from my own childhood experiences that my grief became so overblown and profound because I didn't realize that the enemy was fighting the big me that was trying to carry on. And, it was a hell of a bit of baggage to carry around.
Hmm.
And I couldn't protect my daughter from that. So then when she had her first child in 2015, I only met my granddaughter a handful of times, literally 5 times. And then I was completely estranged But of course, I was still in 2015, I was still in that place of not knowing who I was and not knowing the baggage I was carrying and how that was impacting my relationship, trying to have that relationship with my daughter, which I was just failing at miserably. And yet, up to the age of 14, we'd been pretty close, and done all kinds of stuff together and traveling around to family in various parts of the country and encouraging her to explore stage school. While they were at school, they all did stage school, and she wanted to do that. And she wanted to go dancing, and I encouraged her to do all those things because I'd never had them as a child. So I wanted her to have the experiences and explore and see where she wanted to take her, and then I had it all thrown back at me as it was all about you. Well, it was never about me. It was about me allowing her a place to grow in a place I'd never been allowed to grow. So, there was all this tangle of stuff. And and that's really where my work came from. As I started to understand me, I started to see all the people around me and see how much they needed to find themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I think most parents can probably relate to wanting to give their kids the things that they didn't have
Mm,
growing up.
mm,
So part of
absolutely.
our move to Europe was to give our children the experiences, the diversity that we have over here in Europe. That growing up on the other side of the world, Australia is
Yeah.
very isolated, um,
Yes.
and it feels it sometimes. Definitely felt that way when I was growing up. Um,
Mm,
we even took our girls to try fencing.
wow.
Sounds cool, right?
Mm,
Sounds cool to me because that's exactly what I wanted to do when I was growing up. And the
yeah.
only fencing school in Australia, in Victoria, the state that I was in, was a 2 hour drive. So that
Yes.
was never going to happen.
No.
Take my girls to go fencing, they hated it.
Mm, mm,
First lesson, hated it. We're like, no, no, you don't get to quit after one. Have to give it at least at least one more try.
mm,
Nope, still hated it.
mm. It's
Uh,
so interesting because, for my daughter, it was because the other girls at school were doing these things and she
yeah,
wanted to explore. And I'd not had those things, primarily the financial part of it,
yeah,
because as a single parent, my mum had 4 kids to look after, and there just wasn't a fund to pay for things like that.
yeah,
But the other thing that added to it is that my mother was a Jehovah's Witness and my father's family were Jewish. So I never grew up in a traditional Christian household. And because of the influence, the very heavy influence of Jehovah's Witnesses through my young childhood and into my early teen years, I wasn't allowed to participate in anything where anybody would be giving allegiance to God, giving allegiance to the crown. So I was actually very isolated.
yeah,
Everybody else did brownies and guides and all of those things. I wasn't allowed. Everybody else did Sunday school. And that was like, no, that's not happening. You have to go to the congregation on a Sunday and then go and tramp the streets afterwards. Um, and so a lot of my childhood was about isolation from things that
Hmm.
other people had just took for granted, and birthdays. I mean, we didn't have birthdays. I went to a couple of birthday parties, but I didn't have a gift to take, except something a little homemade that was taken. And it felt very strange. I mean, I didn't actually celebrate my birthday properly until I was 21 years old, when I was with my former, husband, then fiance. So it was a strange world to be growing up in. And I didn't want my daughter to miss out on the normal things of life
yeah,
that had been literally taken away from me in my childhood. So I worked to keep the house together, support her in growing, and have all the experiences she wanted to explore. And I look at it and I think, do I regret it? No, I don't. because she was then able to make those choices herself, whether she continued or not. She came up with all the normal excuses after a while of having an earache and having a tummy ache and blah, blah, blah. And you keep being persistent for a few more weeks, and then you just see, okay, there's something else going on. But she didn't really want to talk about that. And that was where I was starting to see she was very much more like her father than I really wanted, because he
Yeah.
also wasn't a talker. When his brother died in the car accident, well, it was 3 weeks before our second wedding anniversary, we there was no communication. He wouldn't talk about his grief. He wouldn't go and see anybody. We lived in the middle of nowhere in Oxfordshire.
Mm.
Our neighbour was a single man that worked on the farm that I was working on. And he literally took to his sickbed with permanent migraines. So it was a really strange time. And
Yeah.
then, of course, we did have Emma, our baby, and we moved up to the town, had her. And then when she was 5 years old, three generations of his family were killed in a car accident. They lived in Gloucestershire. It
Mm.
did go worldwide on the news because it was so unusual at the time. It was unheard of.
Yeah.
And but the impact of that on him was enormous, and the impact on our marriage was enormous. But in my head, I was keeping it all together because what had I done all my childhood? Been there and done the job I was expected to do, looking after everybody else. And that's exactly what I did in the marriage all the way through. I stepped up, I kept the money coming in, I kept my eye on keeping my family together and looking after everybody and pleasing everybody else. And I completely forgot myself in there.
So if you were used to playing this role of keeping everything together, what what led to the end of that relationship?
I
You
actually had a
mentioned
car.
abuse, you
Yeah,
mentioned
yeah, yeah. Well,
bullying.
he actually
What
started
was the
drinking.
breaking straw?
So he started drinking after his brother's death. Um, and then 7 years later, when the other accident happened, his drinking went completely out of control. And I lived with somebody who was an alcoholic for 18 years,
Okay.
whilst bringing a child into the world and wishing that hadn't happened in her life after the disrupted childhood I'd had. And then I had a car accident, which was nothing to do with me. There was a car stopped in the middle of the road. There was a whole line of traffic in the other lane because it was literally only 2 lanes wide in an Oxfordshire village. And somebody came round the bend, was looking at what was going on around the other side of the road, and wasn't looking where they were going, and ploughed into the back of me. And in those days, local radio helicopter was up there reporting on the traffic. And I just thought, oh, help, they're going to be reporting. And they used to describe the cars. They'd say it was a blue this or a green that or whatever it was, and you'd know. And I just thought, he's the other side of the big main road. And he's got his wind up radio while he's working. He was a gardener. He's going to hear this, and I don't want him to hear this. So it was in the days when we had emergency, mobile phone was an emergency. And I asked the fire brigade, could I make a telephone call? I couldn't get out of the car because the locks had seized, and they checked me over. Yes, everything's fine. Yes, you can make the phone call. And I rang him up and I said to him, I've been involved in an accident. I just needed you to know because a helicopter is up there. And he didn't ask me how I was or if I needed anything or did I need him to come to me. He said, I suppose it was your fault, was it? And in those few words, I knew that everything was gone and that actually I couldn't get to when my daughter was 16 and a point where I thought I might be able to leave safely because I'd literally been hanging on virtually from the time she was 5. But I put myself last because I didn't want her to grow up in a single parent family the way I had.
Mm.
So again, I was the last person in the equation and she was the first person, and that was a big mistake, I know. Excuse me, now it was a massive mistake and I should have just been brave at the time. But that fear, that limiting belief, the limiting decisions we make, all of those things, self-worth, self-value, compassion for myself, self-love for myself, none of those things existed.
Mm.
I had no idea about those things. I just kept putting myself in that box. But the box was getting deeper and deeper and deeper, and I had no comprehension of that until I did the grief training.
Yeah.
It was 2005 when I was eventually forced from the marital home because the violence then became too much, um, with various doors and windows being damaged. And I just thought, we're never going to sell this house with holes in the walls. I've got to do something about this. And it absolutely broke me having to leave. But 24 hours after I'd asked for the divorce, I was summarily told that my daughter had decided she wanted to live with her father.
Okay.
And there wasn't a discussion. I was just told this is what's going to happen. And it absolutely broke me. And I just conceded that I couldn't stay in that atmosphere anymore. And then, of course, I was told I was abandoning and this and that and the other. But of course, I couldn't win. I was
No.
stuck in the middle of something I could not extricate myself from. But it was those few words on that phone call.
Yeah.
In that moment, I knew that there was no love, there was no compassion, there was no consideration, there was no care. I was just a useful human being, bringing money into the house, keeping life and limb together, whilst he was enjoying his nights drinking down the pub, and socializing with his friends, and just pottering in his daily life.
Mm.
And I just looked at myself in that mirror, in the car, as he was saying that to me, and my face told me everything. It's over.
So how much of your growth is has been grieving for past versions of yourself and lost potential versions of yourself?
All of it, to be quite frank, all of it. And, a lot of people will go, well, how can you say that? But actually, this is exactly it. I put myself in a box, and then I put that box in another box, and then I put that box in another box, continually trying to please everyone around me. And at times feeling like I was literally, in fact, I've described it many times, I was the proverbial swan, beautifully gliding along the top and paddling like fury underneath, trying to survive, trying to keep myself in that place where I was being able to do all the things that were expected of me. And the expectation I put on myself was like carrying around the biggest boulder I could find. And literally, a little bit like Atlas, when you see Atlas with
Mm.
the world on his shoulders. I think I had about a dozen worlds on my shoulders. And I felt like I was wading through treacle every single day. It was tough, but I just kept saying, you can do this, you can do this, you can survive, you're stronger than that, you can do this. But I literally was beating myself with a birch every single day without even realizing I was doing it. And I did that for years and years and years. And it wasn't until I was 55 years old that I truly saw it. And that was only, well, this year will be 6 years ago.
Yeah.
So it's taken me a lifetime to really find myself, and I'm still discovering myself, because I've spent so many years pasting the layers that I'm still peeling them. And every time I work with a client, I find something else I need to work on for myself. But each day, each time, each moment is so much easier now,
Yeah.
and so much more powerful as well, because I can look at it for what it is. I'm no longer in that soup of emotion that I used to be in.
Yeah. Absolutely. Now, I know that there'll be people out there who can they hear your story and they'll identify or they'll be able to feel some of those same things within themselves.
Mm.
For those people, who part of your stories or all of the story has gone, oh, maybe that's a little bit of me. What
Mm.
do you have to say to them?
The first thing is about being brave and actually saying to yourself, I forgive you for staying in that place. I forgive you for staying stuck and hurting yourself. Acknowledge what you've experienced. Don't just brush it off as, oh, well, it'll get better in the end. And that thing about time does my head in. How long do you wait? When I first started coaching grief work purely on its own, I did a presentation to a group, and there was a young girl in there who suddenly went absolutely bright red and then flooded with tears. And we gave her that space to compose herself because we were on Zoom. And I said to her, let's have a talk afterwards. And we did. And it transpired that she had been waiting to learn how to grieve for 19 years after her brother had been killed in a car accident.
Mm.
And what I had said in that event, she suddenly realized she'd wasted 19 years of her life just waiting for something she didn't know she was waiting for. And the few words that I'd shared actually about my own brother-in-law's death were enough to make her realize that she had a life to live, and she didn't work with me, but what she was able to do was to take what she'd learned back to the therapist that she'd started working with and then transform her life. So it's about being open to other people's experiences, perception, because others will see in you what you can't see in yourself. So don't take it as criticism, take it as a constructive feedback that somebody else is seeing something where they want to help you, they want to support you, and they might be a bit crass with the way they use their words because not everybody knows how to speak compassionately. But actually, what they're doing is they're saying, you need to look after you. And it goes back to that very old adage of, you can keep filling up the jug, but what happens when it overflows?
Yeah.
The oxygen mask thing that you always hear, put your own oxygen mask on first.
Yeah.
Because the more you care for you and the deep little you inside that's hiding, and all the other versions of you that are in there, and gosh, I had loads, you know, um, every version of you that is nurtured and loved and cared for can then nurture and love and care for you in the present. It's a bit like turning the key inside rather than outside and unlocking everything inside and opening it up.
Yeah. I think that's a beautiful note to wrap things up, Debbie.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I will link to your socials, but is there anywhere in particular that you would like people to find you?
I'm very happy for people to connect or follow me on Facebook or on Instagram. I use those two primarily. I am in lots of other places as well, but they're my main places. But if anybody wants to chat, then I offer a free, no obligation chat, because at the end of the day, it's about being human
Yeah.
and just showing somebody else how to be heard. And it's something
Yeah.
that I found incredibly isolating because I never felt heard.
Yeah.
And I'm always willing to hear for others.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for your time today. It's
No,
been
thank you.
fantastic, Debbie. A beautiful story. I'm glad that after so much, you're able to turn this into something so golden.
Thank you.
Every big decision we've ever made, from leaving toxic jobs to moving across the world, came with an element of fear. But our latest big decision, moving our entire family to the other side of the world, that was the easiest one yet. It's because we worked through our fears before it was time to decide. Now, if you want to move into your future with confidence, free from the fears that hold us all back, we can help. Leandra and I. Work with us one-on-one using the method and face and transform your deepest fears. Reach out through the link in the show notes and we can get started.